Hi, this is Lindsay here in the Renee's Trial Garden, and today I want to show you all about growing dahlias from seed. I have some dahlia tubers here, and this is eventually what they turn into when you grow from seed. And I really love growing dahlias from seed, and the main reason, of course, is because you get so many plants. And when you're growing a mix like this, it's really nice to have a lot of plants so you get a full color mix. So if you want to start dahlias early indoors, kind of the same way you would do tomatoes, I sow them in small pots, and then once they're big enough to transplant, I transplant them into bigger pots, and then once the nights have warmed up to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, we'll transplant them. And also, I'll show you how we direct sow. If you live in a longer season climate and you just want to direct sow right in the garden, once nights warm up to about 50 degrees, we can sow right in our garden bed. So I'm going to show you how I do it. I grow a lot of plants, so I use these plug trays. You can grow dahlias in pretty much any shallow kind of container. I have these simple little seedling trays. You could even use an old Tupperware that you've lost the lid for, poke some holes in it, get some seed mix and grow them in that. You can pretty much grow them in anything. So I want to plant these about a ½ inch deep, so I just make little holes in my plugs with my fingers, just like this. And then spill the seeds out in my hand. And these are nice and big, so they're pretty easy to handle. So with my fingertips, I'll just take one by one and drop them in. It's really hard to see the seeds against the mix because they're the same color. But for a plug tray, I just do one per plug because you'll see that they germinate pretty fast. Within 10 days, they should be germinating. And they grow fast and they're large seedlings, so you only want one per plug, or you want enough space between them in a flat like this. I have all my plugs sown, and I'm just going to go and backfill them with a little mix. Smooth it out on the top. And then I'll make sure to water it in really well. I'll water in my flat. I'm going to use a really gentle spray just so that I don't flood the flat, and at first the seeds, I don't want them to move around. So real gentle spray at first. And I make sure I water very thorough. And let it soak in a few times, and then water until I see it coming out the bottom. So then from now on, I'll make sure that it never dries out, but also doesn't stay soggy at all. You can start dahlias about 6 weeks before your last spring frost, about the same time that you would start tomatoes if you have an indoor setup. Otherwise, you can also sow them and just keep your flat outdoors when the weather's warm and nights are about 50 degrees, about the same time that you would plant sunflowers. To grow them outdoors, you just want to make sure that you have a spot with morning sun and afternoon shade so it doesn't get too hot. I have a flat here that's ready to pot up. As you can see, they have several sets of true leaves and they're nice and established. So I could just pop these right out of the plugs. And you can see they're just right. They're not root bound to where their roots are all packed together. If they were really circling around, you'd want to kind of separate them, but these are just perfect to pot up. So I have my 3½ inch pots here with some fresh potting soil. So I will transplant each one of these. Just make a nice deep hole and put it right in the center. Close your soil up around it. Tap it down a little, and I'll go through and plant my flat. So this flat, I have 2 different dahlias. I have Renee's watercolor dahlias, which have the light green leaves, and I have our Blazing Saddles, which has really nice dark leaves, as you can see. So I just laid all my plugs out on my flat like this. It makes them really easy and quick to just pot up. Got each one of them right in the center. And then after about 6 weeks, I think they should be ready to plant into our garden bed. So again, I'm going to water these in really lightly at first and make sure I thoroughly soak them. And I'll keep an eye on the weather. If it's too hot, I might have to water every day, but if it's not too hot, maybe every other day. So at this stage, it's great not to let them ever dry out, and also not to keep them too soggy wet. I like a spot with morning sun and afternoon shade. That's a really good growing environment for young seedlings. So I'll put these where they're going to grow, and then we'll be back when they're ready to plant out. Okay, our dahlias that we grew from seed and potted up into the 3.5-inch pots are now ready to plant out. You can see how nice and vigorous they are. I've had these growing outside in a spot with morning sun and afternoon shade. And so you can see they are full vigor and ready to plant. So I have my bed here all prepped and ready to go for planting, and I put a good amount of well broken down compost and an all-purpose dry fertilizer just so that they will grow vigorously right off the bat. I give them a nice nutrient-rich soil. Our soil in the trial garden here is very sandy, so I add a lot of compost every time I plant. I think you can never go wrong with adding compost to your soil, because if you have a sandy soil, it helps your soil be like a sponge, so it holds on to water, and so your plants don't dry out as fast. And if you have a more dense soil, it helps the structure of your soil be more draining and give your roots more airspace. So I'm going to plant each plant about 12 to 14 inches apart, and so I like to set them all out first. Got my little ruler so I can make sure I'm evenly spacing them. And then I'll plant rows along my drip line, and then I'll stagger each plant between each other so that they have enough room to grow within each other. Okay, I've got them all set out in the spacing I want, so I'm just going to go through and plant each one. You can see they are just right for planting out. They're not too root bound that the roots are circling in the pot. They're just right, and I'll scruff up the roots a little bit to get them to let go. And this way it helps them establish and let their roots sink down into the soil. So I'll just plant each one so that it's at the same level that it was already growing in the pot. I'm not going to bury the stems at all. I'll just put them at the same level. Go down the line and keep planting. Okay, so I have all the dahlias planted, and we're going to water in really lightly at first because we want it to all soak in right away and not flood up. So I just have a light spray. And I'll make sure I get them fully soaked. Now that I've just transplanted, I'm going to make sure that these don't dry out while they're establishing. I want the soil to stay wet so that their roots really grow into the soil and they establish themselves. They can dry out a little more between watering once they're established because they have big tuberous roots. So I've shown you how to start dahlias in containers, and now I would like to show you how to direct sow them right into the garden. So I'm going to plant right along my drip line here, and I'm going to put groups of about 3 seeds every 12 inches. And then bury them about a 1/2 inch deep. So I'll just make a little hole here, about a 1/2 inch, and then I'm going to drop a group of 3 seeds per hole. And I like to do groups of seeds every 12 inches because ultimately they need that big spacing. So you don't want to sow closer because you're going to end up thinning out to 12 inches. So I cover it up, and I like to use these little strawberry baskets right over my group of seeds, just so that when they germinate, they're protected. Birds aren't going to come through and pick your seedlings out like they love to do. So that's one group. Go down 12 inches, make a little hole about a 1/2 inch deep. Put about 3 seeds and cover it up. And I'll tap the soil down just to get good contact. I'm never going to press down and compact the soil. I just want to make good contact with the seeds so that when I water, it doesn't flood up and move the seeds around. I just want them to stay in place. I'll put my little strawberry basket over the top, and that's good to go. Then I'll plant every 12 inches down the garden bed here, and we'll see how it looks. So I have my bed all planted out, and I'm going to water in really lightly. I start off with a nice gentle spray because you don't want to flood the soil and so that your seeds will move around. You just want it to soak in really gently. And then from here on out, while they're germinating, I'll make sure to keep the bed nice and wet. Not soggy, of course, but nice and wet so that they germinate evenly and don't dry out. So I really like to use these strawberry baskets to protect seedlings where you're planting in this method, where you're planting at a larger spacing, because then all your little groups of seeds are very obvious where they're at. But if you happen to not have a stack of strawberry baskets saved up, you can totally use bird netting, which we love using bird netting all over our garden because it's excellent at protecting against birds and squirrels and bunnies and all the pests that love to eat your seedlings. So it's just what you prefer to use and what you have on hand. You can find our netting at reneesgarden.com, and we also have a great video on how to install it. So here we are with our little bed of dahlias that we had direct sown, and I'm going to take the little baskets off the top, and as you can see, each group has several that have germinated. And so I'm going to go through and thin each group to just one strong plant. So I'm going to go with the biggest plant in the group and then thin out the others. And after this, I'll leave the strawberry baskets off the top because they're big enough, and otherwise they're hitting the top and they get kind of bent over. So I'll just take the baskets off and thin them to just one seedling per group. And I'll go over the entire bed and do this for all of them. So these grew pretty quickly this time of year. I had sown them early summer, and it took only about 1 month for them to be ready to be thinned. Now I'm going to water in. I always want to water in after I do thinning because ultimately you're disturbing the roots of the neighbor seedling that you just thinned out. So good idea to always water in just so that they don't get shocked at all. Best for the life of the plant. So here we are with our mature blooming dahlia bed, all these that we grew from seed, and you can see that they are growing up tall and blooming away. And these are so amazing because this is just a little over 3 months from seed to blooming plants. And again, the reason why I love growing from seed is because you get so many plants. We have a full 7-foot bed of dahlias here, so we'll be able to enjoy these for a long time and make bouquets and watch the bees feast on the flowers. So if you'd like to try your hand at growing dahlias from seed, we have these great varieties available at reneesgarden.com. Thanks for watching.